Welcome to the Daphne Zeppos Teaching Endowment virtual presentation for Alexander Jones, Cheese and Climate Change, Mitigating Impacts, Exploring Solutions, and Building Resilience. Alex is our 2023 Research Award recipient and presented her original presentation at the American Cheese Society Conference in Buffalo in 2024. This presentation has since been updated for a 2025 audience and new climate experiences. The Daphne Zeppos Teaching Endowment started in 2012, funding the Daphne Zeppos Teaching Award as a scholarship to grow a squad of cheese professionals who teach about the history, culture, and techniques in making, aging, and selling cheese. Each year, 2 scholarship recipients go forth to learn about cheese. The scholarships fund expenses related to their research, including travel, living expenses, and more. The recipients will share their learning with industry peers at events like the American Cheese Society Conference and beyond. The scholarships are funded by the Daphne Zeppos Teaching Endowment, a 501c3 nonprofit. And I will pass it on to Alex from here.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Jones. I'm an independent writer, marketer, and cheese educator based in Philadelphia. I received the Daphne Zeppos Research Award in 2023 to support my project on cheese and climate change. And I first presented a version of this research at the American Cheese Society Conference in Buffalo in 2024. So as Janae mentioned, I've updated a little bit for 2025. I wanted to pursue this topic in my research because I was experiencing this cognitive dissonance between my cheese work and what I was learning about climate change and observing the effects of climate change in my own life and how it was affecting, people and places and living things all over the world. And, I noticed that many of the stories about the effects of climate change that I was seeing on cheese had been focused on Europe. Like this story from 2022, when a European heat wave and drought meant that producers of Solaire couldn't actually make the cheese according to the PDO's strict requirements that year. That same heat wave dried up rivers and imperiled dairies that supply makers of Parmigiano Reggiano. And in the Swiss Alps, the centuries old transhumance farming practices and cheesemaking traditions have been changing as the glaciers that define the landscape have begun to disappear. So my research was focused on North America, and it's a really big topic, but I kind of framed the topic of cheese and climate change using these 3 big questions. How are cheesemakers and dairy farmers in the US being affected by climate change? What's the causal relationship between cheese and dairy production and climate change? And how are producers mitigating their climate impact and building climate resilience into their businesses and supply chains? And to learn about this, I talked to a lot of producers and experts. I read a lot of studies, and I got to see some of that work being done firsthand. But before we dig into some farmer stories and some supply chain stories, there are a few quick definitions that I want to share. So adaptation refers to changes in response to actual or expected climate events and their effects. So being ready for the kinds of climate issues we're already experiencing and being prepared for what might come next. Mitigations are actions that can reduce how much and how quickly global warming and its effects happen. So that is cutting carbon emissions, increasing carbon sequestration, that kind of thing. And then climate resilience describes our capacity to bounce back after climate-related events. So an example of that could be farms building soil organic matter to help hold moisture in a water-stressed region. And also a couple of important notes as we're talking about all of this. Not all stakeholders are affected by climate change equally. So climate risk is much more significant for those who are more economically, socially, geographically, and or culturally vulnerable. So for example, the Puerto Rican dairy farmer is going to be more vulnerable to certain climate risks than one in Wisconsin. The farm worker who has to be outside in extreme heat is more vulnerable than the cheesemonger who gets to work inside in air conditioning all day, for example. Not everyone contributes to climate change equally. So when I'm talking about reducing carbon emissions, I'm primarily talking about overall affluent countries in the global north. So that's China, the US, Europe, also like Japan, Australia are kind of included in there too, who consume a disproportionate amount of the Earth's resources and create a disproportionate amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And carbon emissions are the key metric that we're talking about in this talk today. So a lot of the strategies that we're going to cover concern specifically reducing carbon emissions, but there are mitigations that may offer like lots of other environmental, cultural, or economic benefits for people to take into consideration, or drawbacks as well. So to answer that first question, farmers and cheesemakers are being affected by climate change. Like, surprise. Even if your farm or your business or your region hasn't been affected yet, climate risk, which is the chance that a climate-related event or extreme will occur and affect you, is decreasing everywhere. And this is a great example. This infographic is from the USDA's Northeast Climate Hub, which, like, the Climate Hub's website still exists, appears to be unchanged. It's a miracle. That breaks down physical climate risk to dairy farms in that region. So we have increased temperature, changing precipitation patterns, extreme weather, changing pest dynamics, and changing growing seasons. So there's some of the risks that are increasing. And finally, we have economic challenges are increasing as well. So financial climate risk is a really huge part of the equation that isn't talked about quite as much. That's not just the cost of recovery or repairs for climate-related damage or losses, but the cost of mitigation, adaptation, and resilience measures, for example. And these increased costs of doing business as risk intensifies everywhere get put on top of the cost to adapt or recover from these impacts. And then those get passed along, from the producer along the supply chain. This particular example, keep in mind, this is the Northeast US, which is a region with a relatively low climate risk compared to other parts of the country or other parts of North America for a lot of these factors, though that is changing. For example, in California, you could swap in problems like wildfires and water stress in addition to extreme heat. In a place like Puerto Rico, heat and humidity are even more extreme. Feed costs are already astronomically high. We'll talk about why. And extreme weather events like Hurricane Maria in 2017 are like an even more significant threat. So I conducted most of my research in 2023 and 2024. And in the months since midsummer of 2024, when I presented this last, we have unfortunately seen a lot of climate events happening in the country. So we've seen areas of Florida damaged by yet more tropical storms and hurricanes, particularly Hurricane Milton. This scene is from Sarasota. Tens of thousands of acres and thousands of homes and buildings in the Los Angeles area went up in flames in January. Dozens of people were killed and thousands were displaced. This church is about 3 blocks away from my grandmother's old house in Altadena, which burned to the ground along with the rest of her and my dad's neighborhood. And these events, whether they're caused or strengthened by the effects of climate change, are expanding. So they're intensifying in places that are already known for storms or fires or droughts, and they're expanding into places that maybe haven't experienced these issues in recent memory, like Altadena. They're also affecting regions of the US, like the Northeast or New England, that have been considered low-risk climate havens. So that translates to parts of Vermont, experienced cataclysmic flooding for the second year in a row in July 2024, like 1 year to the day from the 2023 floods. And this is what downtown Montpelier looked like after that this last summer. And of course, one of the biggest events that happened last year was Hurricane Helene, destroyed much of the area around Asheville in Western North Carolina, which is a place that wasn't prepared for this kind of flooding and devastation from a hurricane because it has literally never happened there before, like in this configuration of the earth. And that's happening more and more often. And I want to acknowledge like how much things have changed, between when I first prepared this presentation for last summer, both in terms of these climate events and changes at the federal level as of right now in April 2025. So we're in a really different place where these things feel much more real. They were already real, but I was talking about them in a little bit of a more theoretical sense, like talking about ideas, and it's just like so clear that things are really intensifying and we kind of need to be thinking about things a little bit more in terms of action. All right, we're going to move into some of the producer case studies of folks that I talked to. I traveled to Puerto Rico thanks to my DZRA funding back in December of 2023 to conduct some of my research. Several centuries, excuse me, of colonial rule have shaped agriculture there, first with plantation crops like the sugar cane and tropical fruits and coffee that we can see in this 100-year-old map. 80% of food today in Puerto Rico is imported, and the nature of this colonial relationship with the United States causes food prices to be extremely high. I went to Atillo, which is a city on the or town, I guess, on the northeast coast of the Big Island. And it's the epicenter of Puerto Rico's dairy industry. So let's think about it as like the Wisconsin of Puerto Rico. It's where all the dairy farms are. And this is Rafi Lopez Lopez. He's a third generation dairy farmer and owner of Vaqueria El Remanso in Atillo. And just a little bit of context about why Puerto Rico is kind of a fascinating place to look at dairy and like part of why I wanted to look at it. There is, it's 25% of the agriculture sector in Puerto Rico, and dairy is the most significant agricultural product. And despite how much of Puerto Rico's food must be imported, fluid milk is actually not allowed to be imported. So value-added dairy can be imported. Local producers are kind of competing there. But that means that dairy farmers like Rafi, who are selling fluid milk, they don't have to compete with imports. So fluid milk should, be more accessible, right? Plus, many farmers there raise their cows on pasture. They have year-round sun, and that means they have, for the most part, in most parts of Puerto Rico, year-round grass. So in some ways, it seems like dairy farming there should be easy. But Puerto Rico is small. It's bigger than Rhode Island, but smaller than Connecticut, which means that there isn't enough land to pasture all of those animals without supplemental feed. And that means that many farmers are still buying in expensive feed, which has to come from the US due to this colonial relationship. That means their input costs are super high. So even without competition from imports or tariffs, duties, extra costs being put onto imported fluid milk, is another way to think about it. Milk is $7 a gallon at the grocery store in Puerto Rico. So to address these like high input costs, farmers like Rafi are working on optimizing their pastures, improving forage quality, and improving herd genetics to better withstand the heat that's just getting more and more intense every year. And Rafi has played a really big role in that last piece. So at Vaqueria El Romanzo, he has been breeding thermo-resistant cows who can better withstand extreme heat scenarios. And aside from storms like Hurricane Maria and drought conditions that are becoming more intense in some parts of Puerto Rico, the really dire climate risk to people and animals there is extreme heat. So in 2023, there was a record-breaking heat wave there that included a handful of 120-degree days. And the more humid it is, the lower the temperature is for severe health issues or even death to happen for people or animals. And Puerto Rico is very humid, so that coupled with really extreme heat is like a really a recipe for real disaster. So this phenomenon is called wet bulb temperature, and it is something that we have to think about more and more as more parts of the globe are becoming hotter and wetter. And for humans, the critical temperature is 87 degrees at 100% humidity. That's when human health is endangered and we can't cool ourselves off naturally by sweating because the air is so saturated with moisture. And that's a big issue for everybody, but especially people like farm workers who have to endure these extreme conditions to work. Dairy cows can also experience heat stress when the temperature as low as 72 degrees if the humidity is high enough. And when that happens, the animals don't eat as much. That means their milk production drops, their fertility drops, and their immune systems don't work as well. So they're just like not as healthy under these like really stressful conditions. And throughout the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, there are these populations of cattle called criollo that are descended from the first cows brought to the New World through initial waves of colonization, starting with Columbus's second voyage in 1493. And over the centuries, these criollo cattle have developed mutations that help them thrive in these like hot and humid climates. So they can tolerate heat stress much better than cows that don't have this trait. And in the 1950s, in an effort to modernize their dairy industry and boost production, the Puerto Rican government began bringing in Holsteins from the US for dairy farmers to use instead. And some farmers, went all in on Holsteins, and others interbred the Holsteins and the Criollos to create high-producing yet thermoresistant animals called vacas pelonas, or slick cows. And Rafi has been breeding Holstein Criollo genetics into his herd since the 90s, and he has more than 150 slick cows with these thermoresistant traits. And part of that thermoresistance comes from their thinner coat, which gives them a shiny, thick, slick look. You can see this brown girl back here. has a pretty fuzzy coat, but the best way to tell a slick cow from a non-slick cow is that the non-slick cow will have like that little fuzzy tuft of hair on her head, right? And then this slick Holstein in front doesn't have that little tuft, and you can even see in this photo like how slick and shiny she looks because of her thinner coat. So Rafi says he gets about 1,800 pounds more milk per lactation from his slick cows than his non-slick cows. Breeding is more effective. I've seen studies that showed that calving intervals, the space between when a cow, gives birth and then can get pregnant again, is shorter by a month and a half. So that could be really meaningful for a dairy farmer. And Rafi also kind of like made his mark on history with this in another way. He had a bull named Sinba, which was the first homozygous slick bull whose semen was made commercially available. Homozygous just means that like no matter the genetics of the dam, his offspring are going to have slick traits. So very valuable, obviously. He sold that bull to a breeding company, and now Sinba is the source of slick genetics that are being made available in the US, Southeast Asia, South and Central America, and Qatar. And unfortunately and ironically, many farmers in Puerto Rico do not have access to those slick genetics because they now have to buy them from this breeding company, even though they originated in Puerto Rico. So they're too expensive, but the University of Puerto Rico in Mayaguez is working on a project to make that genetic material like more available and more accessible to farmers in Puerto Rico. So we're going to go to another climate vulnerable region and meet another producer. We're going to Southern California, high in the mountains of the Angeles National Forest, which is northwest of Los Angeles. This is Gloria Putnam. She's the owner of Angeles Crest Creamery in Vallarmo, California. She started out raising a few goats on a historic property in Altadena. I actually met her through my grandmother about 10 years ago. She never set out to operate like a traditional commercial cheese business, but she hosted cheesemaking classes. She kind of made her own commercial kitchen, and she informally like made and sold cheese and raw milk and value-added products in her community. And she had her own moment of cognitive dissonance when she realized that people thought her operation was like super sustainable because she was raising animals and producing food. But in reality, she was buying alfalfa hay that was grown in the desert in this water-stressed part of the country and then trucked into the city to feed her animals. So she was like, what if I could move to the mountains where goats are really well adapted and I could model climate resilient, water neutral agriculture? So that's what she did. She purchased a 70-acre property up in the mountains and moved there in 2014, and her goats were able to graze on native plants. She and her partner do have day jobs. She's a physicist by trade. They had a little Airbnb on the property, but basically she was able to feed, at the peak, 250 animals, making cheese, yogurt, and cajeta, selling it to her community. And the goats would browse on a wider and wider array of plants in the landscape each year. So she eventually got to the point where she was only feeding some supplemental hay in the winter, and then a small amount of supplemental grain to the milking goats. But unfortunately, Gloria's vision for what was Angela's Crest Creamery really changed in 2020. And that is when the Bobcat Fire, a wildfire that burned more than 100,000 acres over 2.5 months, tore through the property. Gloria and her partner and the animals were able to evacuate, and like most of the structures were okay, but they had some damage to the water infrastructure. And obviously, all of these browsing lands were burned. And this video, I'll play it again. Uh, this is a video she took after they were able to return to the property from evacuating. And you can see that there's just like still smoldering roots like burning underground. So like that beautiful landscape, that's what this looked like after the fire. And this completely altered Gloria's plan to feed her goats off the land. Like that's just not going to work. Post-fire landscapes are extremely delicate. So especially when we're talking about these like slow growing high desert species that grew on her property, and she wouldn't be able to support anywhere near 250 animals on the land in that condition. So since then, she has very drastically scaled down the operation. She's basically stopped milking animals. She sold off a lot of her herd. The animals that she still does have, she actually has a great Patreon where she's just kind of like sharing goat moments and cool phenomena about the burn scar and like tracking that regeneration. And that Patreon income kind of like helps the hay bill with the goats that she kept. And so the fire really altered her mission. She thinks of herself as kind of like a citizen scientist and sustainability educator now. So she's gone to chronicling the regrowth of the burn scar on and around her property. And she's been replanting native species in the 5 years since the fire. Lots of plants, as we can see, have started growing back, but like a lot of the larger browse shrubs have not returned, and it'll be hundreds of years before trees on the property like pinyon pines and Joshua trees like can return and mature. And when I interviewed Gloria, she brought up the idea of migration in relation to the fire. Like we often think of seasonal annual migration, like alpine transhumance, but in the context of fire-affected landscapes, like prairies and chaparral and pine forests, like that migration traditionally might not mean returning to an area every year. It might mean needing to cycle away from an area for many, many years until the land has regenerated after the fire and can support you and your animals again. And despite the fact that these kinds of events are affecting, producers and herdspeople more and more in the US and elsewhere, like the way that we raise livestock here is not really set up for this kind of style of nomadic shepherding. Although, it is still happening, has been traditionally and still happens in many parts of the world today. But we don't do that in the US. And it just makes me wonder, like, what would it look like if we could move a little closer to that form of resilience? And now we're going to head across the country to another special place, Vermont, specifically the Northeast Kingdom for more goats. This is a very old picture of Lainey Fondiller of Lazy Lady Farm, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. And hopefully you have experienced her funky little goat and cow's milk cheeses. Lainey started her farm more than 40 years ago in Westfield, Vermont, raising goats, making artisan cheese with an off-grid setup powered by solar and wind. That's part of why I wanted to talk to her. Like she was a real pioneer in regenerative power, like running a creamery operation like this. She's also unique in that her underground aging space is naturally climate controlled. So she doesn't run it with electricity, with like, air conditioning or compressor or anything like that. And, one challenge that she described to me was that hotter and more humid summers in Vermont have really started affecting her operation on a microbial level. And those changing weather conditions during her goat cheese making season specifically have thrown off the ripening process for some of her cheeses. So when the heat and humidity are extreme, the cheeses ripen very quickly, which can affect their texture. They can also affect their appearance. It's gotten to the extent that some varieties she just doesn't make during the hottest times of year because the affinage process has become so difficult to control without having, artificial climate control. She finds that stray molds in the cave have become trickier to manage. And as we know, consumers have been conditioned to expect, immaculate snowy white rinds on their bloomies. So that can be a challenge to sell. And these microbial challenges that Lainey talked about, as well as what happened at Angela's Crest Creamery, are kind of examples of how the effects of climate change aren't just making business as usual more difficult. They're actually making these lower carbon and more traditional production methods like browsing goats on the landscape or using geothermal temperature control more difficult or impossible to implement as a climate mitigation measure, which is unfortunate. And I actually learned more about these climate-related microbial changes from Dr. Paul Kinstedt, who's a cheese historian and dairy scientist. And he told me that there are factors like extreme heat, drought, intense rainfall, and other effective climate change that can actually affect feed quality in such a way that directly impacts the cheese making process. So for example, hot, dry summers with extended drought conditions can remove moisture from the feed to the extent that the cultures for certain high moisture cheeses like blues aren't able to grow properly. That's in addition to the fact that apart from feed issues, high heat conditions beyond a ruminant's ideal threshold can impact milk chemistry in such a way that affects the quality and consistency of the finished cheese. An example of this is that I recently heard about an importer selecting more fall and winter batches of Comté from their affineur because the quality is so much more consistent in those months than in the summer, which used to be the more desirable time of year. So that kind of inconsistency can even contribute to cheese producers going out of business because of climate impacts on milk quality. And then finally, traditional practices are becoming more challenging to implement. That is especially true for smaller scale artisan producers like Laney, who there aren't standardizing milk, to even out components like fat and protein. These makers are used to constantly adjusting their processes to accommodate naturally occurring and seasonal changes in milk quality, but climate impacts make that more difficult and less predictable for them. So we've been talking a lot about dairy farmers and cheesemakers, but what about the rest of the supply chain? So for distributors, retailers, and mongers, like those impacts at the producer level are going to affect you too, for the reasons that we talked about earlier. We're going to have higher costs. Things that make dairy farming or cheese making more difficult or more expensive, those costs get passed on to you. So do quality issues or product shortages. So if there are availability issues or batches with like cosmetic or other defects, you might have to triage those or educate customers about those, making them a harder sell. Logistical issues caused by climate disasters and adverse conditions can keep product or other supplies from getting to or from your business. Power outages can create conditions where the power grid gets maxed out or you just totally lose power, which can lead to product loss, which leads to economic loss. And also labor issues. If your staff can't get to work because of a disaster, or if their apartment is flooded, or if your farmer's market is canceled because of extreme weather or a heat wave, those all present operational challenges for you. And then for workers, they present safety issues and lost wages. And, we've been talking about dairy farmers and cheesemakers, and that's partially because so much of what is written and researched about cheese and climate or, dairy production and climate focuses on agriculture. And there's a reason for that that we're going to talk about pretty soon. Um, and I wanted to talk to more folks kind of past that point of the supply chain, distributors, mongers, retailers, when I did my initial research, but I wasn't able to find any, like folks who had been directly affected by climate change, right? But unfortunately, as we talked about, 2024 made it too easy to find folks in the space who have been directly affected by climate change. And if you watch the devastation of some of these hurricanes in Florida play out through social media, like I did, you might recognize this face. This is Louise Converse. She's the owner of Artisan Cheese Company in Sarasota, Florida. And she markets her business by like being really on top of Instagram stories and TikTok. She's just like always on there, inviting people in, sharing updates, showing off new products. And unfortunately, like during the storms, she was kind of all over her Instagram stories as well. And we got a peek into what her experience was like weathering Hurricane Milton in October 2024. So I interviewed Louise about 4 months after the hurricane, but the impacts on her business actually began before Hurricane Milton made landfall. So her shop had to close for a tropical storm earlier in that year. It also closed for Helene, which was in September. And then for Milton, she closed down, and that is when she sustained the most damage at her shop. And something I took from Louise's story, both as a business owner and as a resident of this part of Florida, was how much the damage to communities around her harmed the shop indirectly. So there were times when, she or her staff couldn't leave their homes or couldn't get to the shop, or other reasons they couldn't get to the shop. But there were also just towns and neighborhoods in the area that had been covered in like 6 feet of water. There were lots of fires, like people's homes burned down because if your home is on stilts, because you live in Florida and you have these floods, but you have an electric car and you park it underneath, the battery will catch on fire when it makes contact with salt water and it just has to burn until it stops burning. And that meant that people lost their homes. So with each successive wave of these storms in the summer and fall of 2024, like even if her shop isn't directly affected, like the business is impacted, whether that's her customer base, whether that's just like chaos kind of in the area is going to have an effect on like one small business. Unfortunately, this was also all happening during Q4, which is the time when cheese shops make their money, as we know. So people in Louise's community are sustaining serious damage or even like losing their homes. The streets are lined with debris. Things look apocalyptic, is what she told me. And in a place like Florida, where those homes are often owned by people who come down part-time for the winter, like maybe those people just don't come this year. Because maybe their home was damaged, maybe they don't have anywhere to go to, or just because it's too depressing, like they're going to skip it. And during this is her shop, during Hurricane Milton, Louise reached out to her community. She had to put a lot of product into walk-ins at a neighboring restaurant and a local college, which both had generators because she did not have one. Um, Without that, she would have lost a lot of product, but she was luckily able to avoid most of the potential lost product she could have had to deal with. But she still described to me like how all of these different factors affected her customer base and then how that impacted her business. So you know how when there's like a blizzard coming or a storm coming, everybody like goes to the grocery store and buys all the milk and bread, right? People are stocking up on staples in the lead up to an event like this. They're not necessarily visiting Louise to buy some fancy cheese or like some specialty items. So then the storm hits and her shop was out of power for a week. So there's kind of the acute phase of like I can't even open if I wanted to. Maybe a week later, the power comes back on, but the customers just aren't buying like they usually do for obvious reasons. They're dealing with the fallout themselves. So she's getting 10 to 20% of her usual sales. And then there was physical damage to the building as well, which she leases. She doesn't own it, but she sustained damage to the roof and the AC unit. One of her reach-ins stopped working. And then these beautiful gardens, unfortunately, like were also totally destroyed by the seawater. And so, this festive time when customers are supposed to be coming back into town and like, seeing her again after being away for 6 months and then starting to celebrate and shopping and all of that good stuff, that just doesn't happen in the same way this year, like on top of all of these other impacts. So there's very little catering. The mood is very somber. People are dealing with these like really significant losses or just like not coming down to the area like they usually do. So she estimated that the business was $60,000 behind where it should have been due to these closures and these long tail impacts from these hurricanes. And I asked her, I was like, what kind of resources are available to someone in your position? How can people rebuild, like business owners, like what support exists? And FEMA is only for individuals, it's not for businesses. So her only other option was an SBA loan, and she had one for COVID, but she was not in a position to take out another loan. Her employees were able to apply for relief from a hospitality workers fund for some of the work that they missed. But like even flood insurance probably wouldn't have helped her. Like she had kind of been burned by the fact that she had a flood insurance policy before Hurricane Ian a few years ago, and they only paid out like a very small fraction of the losses that she claimed, and it just wasn't worth it to get the flood insurance. So I asked her, I was like, what would make a difference for somebody like you, for a business owner like you, for next time? Because we know that there's going to be a next time, right? um and she was just like, I wish we could get funds to buy a generator. Like that would be really meaningful for us. That's kind of the only thing that we could control is like if we could get some funding to buy a generator, that would be really helpful. And the story is extremely heavy. And these are the kinds of impacts that we're going to be seeing more of on independent cheese shops, cheesemakers, dairy farmers, and other businesses along cheese supply chains when they are impacted by extreme weather events caused by climate change. And, of course, now that's on top of higher costs due to tariffs and a lot of other economic uncertainty. So, a bad situation is like becoming more and more potentially risky. And Louise doesn't have the answer to this. I'm so grateful that she was willing to share her story, which is unique, but unfortunately is not going to be the last time that we hear something like this happening. She and her team are doing their best to just like keep going. Um, and she did a small GoFundMe to rebuild her gardens, which are people really loved. She kind of thought of that as like for the community, but she said to me, she's like, I can't put my hand out for support when my community is hurting. So even crowdfunding doesn't feel like something that people can always access when everybody in the community is hurting. But what she did do as soon as she was able to open, and is kind of what she had been doing this whole time with the shop for more than 10 years, which is to make it a hub of community. So as soon as the power comes back on and she's able to like open up, she goes on social media, she invites people to come in and just like charge devices, hang out. Like she does her best to emphasize what is like fun and positive and delicious about the products in her case. She tries to get open as quickly as she can and just like make things feel beautiful and normal for customers when they are ready to come back to her. And in return, she draws a lot of strength and encouragement and support back from them. which is, if there's any silver lining, like it's kind of that she's able to like finally open up and help take care of her community a little bit when she's able to. So we're gonna like shift gears away from producer stories, and we're going to start looking at that connection between cheese and climate change. So this is a breakdown of global carbon emissions by source. This is from the EPA using 2022 data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Um, the energy sector is in blue. That's like about a third of the carbon emissions. Industry is in green, about a quarter of emissions. And then here we have AFOLU, which stands for agriculture, forestry, and other land use, in yellow at just under a quarter, according to this data. So let's drill down on those emissions in the AFOLU sector. This is a comparison between two leading studies that break down the sources of greenhouse gas emissions from global food production. So farming is responsible for anywhere between 1/4 to 1/3 of agriculture's global greenhouse gas emissions, the act of farming, right? That's followed by land use changes like deforestation. And then much smaller in purple on these graphics are the supply chain emissions, like packaging, processing, and transportation. So the study on the right has those additional sort of tan pieces at the top. Those are greenhouse gases expended from post-retail waste and cooking. So this is why dairy farming is such a big part of cheese and climate research. Things like packaging are like loom large in our minds as we're like using lots of plastic wrap at the cheese counter or buying cheese and throwing away like packaging. We're like, oh my God, this is like so wasteful. It is, but the biggest impact does come from the actual farming process. And that's across the ag sector. This is not dairy specific, but it ends up being true of dairy as well. So what about different kinds of agricultural products? This is a conversation that comes up a lot in the cheese space when we're talking about things like, climate impact of different types of foods. So this is a graph of global greenhouse gas emissions broken down by kilogram of food. So we're talking by weight. Beef is at the very top by this wide margin. It's by far the most carbon intensive to produce by this metric. I was really surprised to see how high on the list that cheese is. Globally, it's the 5th largest source of greenhouse gas emissions by this metric, with almost double the emissions of pork and close to 2.5 times that of poultry, which really surprised me. Within that category, as within all of these livestock categories, there are farming practices and production methods that do cause some variation in emissions due to sequestration. And obviously, because we're, taking 10 pounds of milk to make 1 pound of cheese, we're going to have like higher emissions by weight because we're concentrating that nutrition, right? So let's look at some other ways to measure this. Weight is not the only metric of a food product when we're talking about feeding people. So this is the breakdown of greenhouse gases per 1,000 calories produced. So calories, and the top 10 aren't all that different. There's cheese a little bit further down this time. All livestock products, with the exception of tomatoes, are in the top of this graph. Tomatoes apparently like way more carbon intensive by calories, jumped from 11th to 5th place. And then just for good measure, because we're talking about a protein, right? Here is the same data broken down by protein. So beef continues to outpace everybody else. That is a really meaningful takeaway, I think, from this data. And cheese does have a lower emissions impact than beef, lamb, and shrimp, but a higher impact than milk, pork, poultry, eggs, and then those plant products, beans and nuts, etc. So where do those emissions from producing dairy and cheese come from? This is a breakdown of global emissions from the livestock supply chain. This is not just dairy animals. This was the data I could find. If anyone has dairy-specific data on this, I would love to see it. This was published by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization in 2013. And we see that enteric fermentation is the biggest contributor. So that's the methane produced by the rumen in ruminant animals, just like existing, standing around, right? And globally, 77% of that is emitted by cattle, 13% by bison, and just 10% by small ruminants like sheep and goats. Manure management and application in all but the smallest livestock operations add up to around 25%. So if that animal waste isn't simply being worked back into the pasture, but has to be managed with lagoons or composting or cleaned out of a barn, that nitrogen off gases as carbon emissions. And applying that waste to the land as fertilizer is also a big source of emissions. Growing feed is another big chunk. Then we have energy use, land use change, and emissions that happen after the product leaves the farm. So yes, cheese and dairy production and ruminant livestock production overall have a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions and contribute to climate change. And as much as beef production or burning fossil fuels or heavy industry or energy production, no. But a big chunk of agricultural emissions do come from the dairy industry. So when it comes to mitigating carbon emissions in dairy production and livestock farming in general, there are three main strategies. We can reduce enteric methane emitted by ruminants. We can reduce greenhouse gases created by their waste. And we can improve feed efficiency and then reduce the carbon impacts of feed production. So let's talk about some of those ways to reduce emissions where they begin, which is in the rumen. Organic additions to the animal's diet, like red algae that we see here, linseed, certain tannins and essential oils, and other plant materials have been shown in studies to reduce enteric methane in dairy cattle anywhere from 10 to 50%. That reduction is even more significant for beef cattle. And other feed strategies like increasing the fat content of feed have also been shown to reduce methane. There is also a synthetic feed additive for lowering enteric methane that's sold under the trade name Bovaer. It's also called 3-NOP. It was approved by the FDA in 2023 with reductions of methane up to 30% in dairy cows. But we don't really know how those feed additives might affect milk for cheese making. And, I've seen on social media some, both consumers and dairy farmers and like cheesemongers pushing back against the use of Bovaer in the UK and EU on social media because some countries have begun to mandate methane reducing feed management strategies among other greenhouse gas reducing strategies, but Bovaer is the only one that has been officially approved. And I'm simplifying a very complex issue. But a lot of farmers are against this because of those increased costs, and what they see as government overreach. Some consumers don't like the idea of eating dairy products from cows fed the synthetic additive. But this is kind of an example of how complicated it can be to implement some of these emissions reducing strategies, like even in a country where like this is coming from the top down, right? Like Denmark, for example, because sometimes our idea of what is like green or natural or sustainable is going to conflict with the methods through which we might be able to lower those emissions. And, those are our key metric when we're talking about mitigating climate change. And, I do think agriculture and every other industry should be working really aggressively to lower emissions, but that is really difficult to do without that top-down implementation and support. Here is another way that we can talk about to reduce methane. The next strategy for methane reduction is mitigating waste. We're going to talk about just a couple of different methods that dairy farmers at different scales are using. Anaerobic digesters or biodigesters seen here, they work by allowing microbes to process stored manure. They capture the methane gas the microbes give off, and then that stays out of the atmosphere and it can be burned to power vehicles or generate electricity. Biodigesters can also run on other kinds of organic waste like food scraps. And, there are definitely some benefits to biodigesters, and they were heavily subsidized during the last federal administration by grants and loans. And some European countries are starting to mandate them for dairy farms and other livestock producers. And when you see the carbon that is offset from using a biodigester, you can see why they've become popular. So this graphic is from a University of Wisconsin-Madison study from 2019. It modeled greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of milk from a range of dairy farming practices. So those 5 columns on the left, G1 through G5, those are different grazing scenarios. C is a confinement scenario, so the animal's confined in a barn, and CAD is confinement with a digester. And their model scaled each operation to the same level of production. And as you can see, there is a significant net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for the anaerobic digester because of the electricity being generated from burning the methane, which doesn't have to be sourced elsewhere. So that's that white bar in comparison to all of the other ones is expressing that offset fuel. So there are other benefits. The digestate or byproduct from this process can be used as a fertilizer. Livestock farmers who install biodigesters can often supply a portion of their own energy needs, which results in a cost savings, or depending on the scale, they can even generate revenue from selling that energy to the local utility or by converting the methane into natural gas and then selling that. But there are some drawbacks to biodigesters. They're very expensive, like an investment of millions of dollars, so not necessarily widely accessible, even with subsidies and tax credits. I talked to Ruthie Lazenby, who's actually a former cheesemonger who is currently an environmental law and policy fellow at UCLA. She writes about biodigesters from an environmental justice perspective. And her paper, Rethinking Manure Biogas, which you can read online, I'll just Google that title. She makes the point that biogas systems primarily benefit contain animal feeding operations or CAFOs that have liquid manure management systems, aka manure lagoons, which you may have heard of. And they typically have at least 2,000 hogs or 500 cows, but often like many thousands of cows. And they need to be at this scale to be financially viable. We do have a lot of dairy farms and other livestock farms like this in the US. Carbon emissions aside, these CAFOs have a long track record of causing environmental degradation. Stored liquid manure can produce odors and co-pollutants like volatile organic compounds and hydrogen sulfide. There's also a real serious risk of water contamination in case of spills from the lagoons. And if those lagoons aren't covered, they can increase nitrogen emissions by as much as 80% during storage. That significantly degrades air quality and creates public health issues for people living nearby who are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and low-income communities. And that's not to mention that the fact that when you're burning methane, you still get CO2. Methane does have a shorter life in the atmosphere, but 80 times the heat trapping power of CO2. So that is why some people see this as a good trade-off. But CO2 is more permanent in the atmosphere. So, you know, advocates of biodigesters promote them as a way to swap out a more harmful greenhouse gas for a less harmful one in the short term, but you're still generating carbon emissions. And generating alternative energy sources like this, even with that like great displacement of the carbon emissions that we saw in the University of Wisconsin study, it's only a net benefit if we're actually reducing energy use overall, not just adding these renewable or sustainable energy sources on top of conventional fossil fuels that we're using. So that's kind of an example of a tech-driven industrial scale way to address methane emissions from manure on dairy farms. But another approach that might be more accessible to small and mid-sized farms is using biochar to mitigate emissions from manure. It's been used for 10,000 years as a soil amendment, and it's been shown to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from land use change when applied to soil. And to make biochar, you put biomass, so like organic material, which could be wood, crop residue, fuel crops that you grow for this purpose, yard waste, or even digestate from the methane digester, through the process of pyrolysis, which involves heating the material to a very high temperature in an oxygen-free environment. So you might be like, doesn't burning stuff release carbon emissions? Like, how is this good? And the answer is yes, but the trick is that pyrolysis retains about half of the carbon in that material, while regular burning only retains 3% in the product that's left, and decomposition retains less than 10 to 20% after 5 to 10 years. So we're actually trapping more of the carbon in the material when we do pyrolysis, plus we get the carbon mitigating benefits of using that biochar. And the way that it can help with manure management is that you can apply biochar to the surface of your stored liquid manure to drastically reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. I spoke with farmer Sam Dixon at Shelburne Farms in Vermont about how they are using biochar on their manure lagoons. Shelburne has a herd of brown Swiss cows, including about 100 milkers. They are not your average dairy farm because they are a nonprofit that has set really aggressive goals to reach net zero emissions on the farm by 2028. They're trying to do that by sequestering more carbon in their pastures and woodlands, and also by reducing emissions from their manure. So this is biochar delivery day at Shelburne. The farm has to store manure for about 6 months of the year, like the winter, basically, when they can't spread it on field. So they have to store it in lagoons. And when the biochar is spread over the surface of those lagoons, it absorbs a significant amount of nitrogen that is off-gassing in the form of ammonia. And studies show that biochar can reduce nitrogen emissions from manure by up to 80%, Can also reduce the odor from those lagoons, which is valuable for small to mid-sized dairy farms who maybe do some form of agritourism or education or on-farm sales. It's definitely a lower tech, naturally derived strategy for reducing waste emissions on livestock farms. It's like a little more adaptable and accessible to a wide range of farm operations, and actually mitigates rather than increases the potential for environmental degradation or environmental justice issues in that farm's area. And before we leave the topic of waste, I want to emphasize one thing that I learned in my research is that one of the most expedient things a small dairy farm can do to reduce its carbon footprint is to improve its waste management and mitigate emissions from that process. So improving your waste management strategy without even measuring your impact is going to reduce your carbon impact. So if you can compost rather than store manure in the winter, or if you can use one of these mitigation tools, that's a smart thing to do. There are also these micro digesters. They almost look like a little tractor that work a little differently than the big biodigesters we just looked at that are being developed in Europe that could potentially be promising one day. So what about carbon sequestration? Like, can't we really help climate change by planting a bunch of trees? This is something that comes up a lot especially when we're talking about pasture and grazing. And incorporating silvopasture into grazing areas on a dairy farm definitely has a lot of benefits. It can sequester carbon for a finite period of time as those trees are reaching maturity. You get the benefits of shade and lower temperatures for animals, the potential for new income streams from harvesting fruit, nuts, or timber, depending on what you plant. You get reduced soil erosion, you get water quality benefits, you're supporting biodiversity, all kinds of great reasons to plant silvopasture, and people should totally do it. But the main drawbacks of silvopasture as like a carbon emissions mitigating measure are that it is a long-term investment from planting trees to mature trees. And depending on, your relationship to land or like where you are in the life of your farm business, you may not be able to control what happens to that land in 10 or 20 years. The other drawback, or not really a drawback, but a correction to a misconception, is that you cannot sequester your way out of climate change, whether that's through planting trees or through other sequestration methods. Like mitigation is the first and most meaningful priority in greenhouse gas mitigation. And then sequestration has to support that. But if we're not mitigating, sequestration isn't going to make a difference. So that brings me to something that some of you have probably been wondering, which is like, aren't ruminants who are raised on pasture like actively sequestering carbon? Like, isn't grass-based livestock farming like a net benefit when it comes to climate? And, can't we start pasturing more and more livestock as a solution to climate change? So the short answer is that pasturing livestock can have less of an impact than conventional practices, but that does not mean much with our current farming systems and levels of consumption. So I'm going to cite some data from a 2017 report from the Food Climate Research Network, which includes researchers from several European universities who looked at the question of whether producing beef and dairy in grazing systems was really more sustainable and whether it's viable for adoption as a climate mitigation measure. This is from, the paper is called Grazed and Confused, if you want to look at it. The report concludes that livestock grazing systems do sequester carbon, but not enough. Globally, grazing systems contribute about 20% of annual livestock emissions, but they can offset an estimated 20 to 60% of their own emissions, or 4 to 11% of total livestock emissions, or between 0.6 and 1.6% of emissions from all human activity. And to put that in context, we need to cut emissions globally by 60% in the next 5 to 10 years to stave off like the worst climate impact. So it's like a tiny fraction of the whole pie, unfortunately, even though grazing versus non-grazing is definitely better. Unfortunately, we don't actually have enough land to meet global demand for meat and dairy by transitioning production to grazing systems. So we can't just switch everything over to grazing and get that 20% reduction. They also point out that reductions in greenhouse gases of all types are urgently needed, which is true. And that means that we need to be thinking about reductions in the production and consumption of animal products, not growth. And this is kind of the kicker that they conclude with. While grazing livestock have their place in a sustainable food system, that place is limited. And when we hear things like reductions in the production and consumption of animal products. We hear things like limited about consuming cheese and dairy and animal products in general. People in the cheese world, like, that's a hard thing to hear sometimes. Unfortunately, it's not just from this one paper. Other experts and institutions advocate for a global reduction in the consumption of animal products. This image accompanies the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet. You may have seen the Guardian article about how a beef and dairy industry group was actually like actively working to discredit and harass them online after they published these findings. Find that article. It gives you some insight into how a lot of this information works. They're a nonprofit that advocates for science-backed food system transformation, and you can just see that is the cheese and dairy section. It's a small, it's there, it's a piece of the pie, but it's a small piece of the pie, right? That is what their recommended dairy consumption looks like. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's sixth assessment report advocates for reducing corporate concentration of livestock, particularly in the meat industry, among other recommendations like this. And so, this is unfortunately why, as some folks have suggested in response to previous versions of this talk, we can't just replace industrial meat and dairy in Western diets with regeneratively raised or grass-based or small-scale animal products. Because even if that's something we wanted to do on a global scale, which we'll see that we don't really want to do, we don't have the land to do that, to meet that same consumption level. So I don't want to overlook the fact that we should be farming with these pasture-based methods that also offer additional environmental or ecosystem or animal welfare benefits, along with things like fossil fuel reduction and decarbonizing energy. But like, we have to wrap our heads around the fact that we can't like graze our way out of this problem. And as people who are raising or making or selling or distributing these products and whose livelihoods depend on this, which includes me as well, it can feel difficult and scary to like take that in and think about what that might mean. However, this is the thing. Americans have been steadily eating more cheese for more than a century every year. And despite the increased availability of plant-based products in recent years, that does not seem to be stopping. This data continues into 2022, and this is USDA data. Actually, I'm going to skip that slide. So that's despite the fact that many, 2/3 of consumers believe in climate change. They want to do something about climate change. They believe that like they are, humans are contributing to climate change, but like our consumption habits are just like not matching up what needs to be happening, right? And so all of these charts and data that we've just been like, getting shoved into our eyeballs for the past 10 minutes, I want to zoom out to like ground us a little bit in our current reality and close with some possible action steps or areas of focus. So this chart from the Climate Action Tracker shows projections for warming based on what policies are currently in place worldwide. The green line at the bottom, 1.5C compatible, that's how much we'll have to cut emissions to stay at or near 1.5C of warming, which we already blew past that in 2024, actually. That blue section at the top is where what we're doing now will get us. So at 3 degrees Celsius of warming, the world's largest cities will experience a 50% increase in the frequency and duration of extreme heat. The number of people who will need double our historic cooling demand increases by a factor of 22, and the likelihood of insect-borne diseases will also increase, according to the World Resources Institute. And reminder, we need to reduce emissions by 60% like globally in the next 5 years to avoid like these worst impacts by 2100. So we know that climate change is already happening. The farmers and retailers and cheesemakers that I talk to are feeling its impacts already. We're seeing the impacts already. I imagine most of you out there have observed this as well. So what do we do as an industry? We're not only in the position of needing to reduce our own carbon emissions, we also need to protect our animals and farmers and makers and mongers from these effects of climate change, direct or indirect, that are caused by all human activities that create carbon, right? And what I've arrived at in this research is that, like, this is what we have to figure out. Not just how do we use strategies to reduce emissions on our own farms and businesses and homes, but how we can adapt our farms and businesses and homes and communities to be more resilient in the face of this growing chaos. Because, like, it would be one thing if we were solely responsible for climate change, I would feel even, like, slightly more empowered to, like, say, like, at least we have a plan, let's, like, work on it. But there are so many other variables that are out of our control, like as an industry, as individuals. And this is especially true as I'm speaking now in April 2025, when the federal government has frozen billions of dollars in funding for climate-related projects that would have gone directly to helping farmers mitigate, adapt, and build resilience. They've actually taken an actively hostile approach to climate action or research in many of the executive orders and public statements from the federal government. So that's like, we weren't in a great situation, last year, but like we're kind of in a really bad scenario right now in terms of turning this around. Again, we're only one country, but we're a big country. The rest of the world is working on this, hopefully, or parts of it are still. But what we are going to be doing, not just with climate, but with like environmental protections, like overall, is really, really imperiled, is honestly the word to use. So we are looking currently at this scenario in blue right now with like the current the US's current involvement in climate action with the current administration. And in light of all of this information that is not super hopeful or positive, I want to go back to Louisa's story at Artisan Cheese Company in Florida. So, I talked with her for like an hour about this really difficult time, financially, emotionally taxing, very scary, traumatizing things that were happening in her community and at her store, right? But I kind of left the conversation with the idea, like the emphasis that she made on community. She has invested a lot of time and energy over the years in building community at her store via her online presence, in the shop, using it to invite people in, even using, her platform to keep people informed during these climate events. And it's thanks to that community that she was able to reach out for help to save most of her product before Hurricane Milton. So what I want to encourage you to do, like wherever you are, and like to the extent that you can, is to like prepare to think about ways that you and your communities can help each other and protect each other to minimize the impact of climate change. For me, that's been changing my diet. Trying to only buy meat if I actually know the person, not just, oh, that's the farmer I see at the farmer's market, but like know the person who's making it. Eating a lot less of it, buying less stuff in general, and I volunteer my time with some organizations that are kind of aligned with, climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, which are an urban orchard nonprofit and a mutual aid meal delivery organization where I live in Philly. And I talk about this stuff too with people like you. Um, and there are so many more things to talk about around climate change, including stuff that's, I'm sure what's happened just like last week, we could do a whole presentation on that, like in terms of changes at the federal level. And there's so much more of my research that I wish I could share, which I will be sharing through my newsletter and hopefully new audio project soon. But I want to end my presentation with some big picture takeaways for how we should respond to the climate crisis based on the work that I've done. So it's important to remember that every fraction of a degree makes a huge difference. Like, mitigation is still really important. If you are a farmer, please do what you can to reduce emissions, boost sequestration, and support your ecosystem. I know that's harder with so many of these funding sources that supported these beneficial things not being available right now, but like if there are things you can do, please do them. If you're a retailer or distributor, look for ways to reduce waste, cut energy use, minimize packaging, reduce the carbon footprint of your facility to the extent that you can. If you're an individual, like, please try to do the same thing at your home scale, like cutting energy use, choosing renewable energy if that's an option for you, not wasting food, considering the climate impact of your consumption, making your home more energy efficient, changing your transportation habits if that's available to you. Number two, carbon sequestration doesn't make a difference without mitigating emissions. So you can't keep producing emissions and hope that the trees you planted will cancel it out. doesn't work that way. If you see news sources or tech entrepreneurs or whatever talking about things like carbon capture or sequestration without also talking about mitigation, like they're not legitimate, right? We need to prioritize mitigation and then sequestration. Three, individual solutions can only take us so far because we need drastic and immediate systemic change and collective action, like globally across all sectors, to actually address this problem. But individual or community level solutions might be all that's available to us, right? We can do our best to adapt and build resilience in our own communities. So think about like what kind of preparations can you make in your communities, in your home, as an individual that will help adapt or be more resilient in response to climate change. And four, we can still ask for more from our industry organizations and institutions, whether that's agriculture nonprofits, local business groups, neighborhood groups, or organizations like ACS. They have done some climate related work in their committees, the Climate Impact Task Force, and their strategic plan. A lot of that has been focused on messaging around climate change. I would really love to see what resources or work they might be able to offer in terms of the adaptation and resilience aspect of responding to climate change for their membership. So, like, it would be really awesome if we could start thinking about that rather than how we can message about animal products to the public. This to me, this need is more dire. We can also whether it makes a difference or not, I'm still trying to do this. We can also advocate for ourselves with our elected officials whose job it is to represent our interests in government at the local, state, and yes, even the federal level. So continue to put pressure on those people who are supposed to be doing a job for us. And then number five, we got to get ready. We got to have a plan. We got to build networks. So what can you and your neighbors or your team or your colleagues or customers or suppliers or your cheese guild or like your colleagues from the industry in your area, like what can you do now to get ready for disruptions in the future? Can you identify where you'll bring your product if the power goes out in a storm? Can you buy that generator? What can you plan for? With the resources you have and the abilities that you have. Like maybe that's keeping product moving and keeping the business open, or supporting your employees, or protecting your suppliers, or just like being ready for maybe when the power is going out, or like if your basement floods or things like that. So there's a lot you can't prepare for, but there is a lot that you can. And remember that like when you need it, like ask for help and then also offer help to your community. That's where I'm going to leave you guys. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. And thanks to the Daphne Zippos Teaching Endowment for supporting my research. This has been an amazing project to work on, and I'm going to keep working on it. If you're interested in talking cheese and climate change, I would love to hear from you. You can find me at alexandrajones.net, read my newsletter MilkFed on cheese culture and climate, or find me on Instagram. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was fantastic. I hope that you all have questions.
Hello. Thank you for
Hi.
calling on me. I was wondering if you encountered it on your research, like, is there any breakout of like cheese's specific impact, like within the broader dairy sector, or like cheese's climate impact versus fluid milk, or I'm just kind of trying to like make sense of this whole picture here. Did you encounter any research that offered any insight?
I didn't find anything directly addressing that. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because not being affiliated with an academic institution like limits to what I can see or like the research that I can access. So I'm not saying it's not out there. I personally did not find it when I was looking. Those three bar graphs that show the climate impact of the different foods, when we're talking about cheese versus milk, through all of those metrics, cheese is more significant, but that's because, especially by weight, like we're just reducing the weight of the gallon to much smaller. So that concentration is going to be higher. I want to look more into that. I think also like there is something to be said for getting that fluid milk out the door, like day in and day out, versus processing, aging, taking time to do that. Potentially having just like longer supply chains, longer storage and cold storage that could make cheeses impact higher. But I think a lot of it is just the fact that we're concentrating those nutrients, we're concentrating those solids. And so that's just kind of like, it doesn't necessarily mean that the cows are giving off more greenhouse gases when they're making fluid milk versus when they're making milk for cheese. Um, but it does mean that like those numbers aren't going to look as good for cheese. I don't think that's necessarily a super meaningful like cheese versus milk. Um, but I think that's a question to like further explore. And I will tell you when I find something about that, if and when I do.
I was just thinking like it could be an argument for like be more sustainable, eat more cheese, like that's the more sustainable option when it comes to the dairy ecosystem. Like if you think of the idea of like taking all that, like basically when people are shipping fluid milk around the country, they're shipping water, And so if you think about like taking that water out of the product, and having that more concentrated version, I mean, it would be interesting to see any data on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to talk to like a logistics person about like space taken up in the truck, about weight being hauled, you know what I mean? And how that would differ. I think there are many other like, climate change is one constellation in like the factors that make our food systems unsustainable. And I think there are many aspects of fluid milk consumption that are like, I don't want to say unnatural, but that are less they're newer, they are colonial, they are like a little bit different than cheese, which we're kind of maybe flow again, this is like me editorializing, maybe is a little bit more in tune with like natural human rhythms, for was what I'm going to call them. Um, like we don't need a bajillion people to be drinking a ton of milk every day. Like we're doing that to kind of prop up the dairy industry that we have in this country, which is really, really based around fluid milk. And despite, I didn't show you the graph that had like fluid milk goes down, all value added products go up over the past like 40 years, but that's been the trend. Value added goes up, fluid milk goes down. But the American dairy industry really, really clings to fluid milk for like a variety of reasons. So, like, I think there are reasons aside from like the emissions question to maybe prioritize cheese or use cheese as an entry point into like talking about sustainability in food or potentially having a more sustainable diet. Whereas fluid milk feels kind of artificially propped up to me. Again, I still have a half gallon of it in my fridge, but yeah, I love that question, and maybe I can explore it for a cheese state post sometime.
Anytime.
I have a question if the floor is open.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna try and make this succinct. I mean, so many things we could talk about. So, obviously, like cheese and dairy has gone through so many different like improvements for better or worse and adaptations. And I feel like, especially in the artisanal scene, right, there's such this emphasis on like, and I don't want to say like glorifying, but like we love to talk about like traditional cheese making and putting the emphasis on traditional cheese making. And I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, but arguably following traditional methods like grass-fed herds is more beneficial to the environment. But I guess I'm wondering your thoughts on like at what point are we going to have to like I don't want to say ditch the tradition, but start adapting in a way that, we can like find a middle ground of upholding traditions, but like adapting rather than just letting a cheese die out, right? Like, for instance, like a PDO, like to be like, oh no, like we have to adhere to A, B, C, and D. Okay, but what if you can't do that? Do you just let the cheese like die? I'm just wondering, if you have any thoughts on like, yeah, I guess upholding traditions, but also moving forward in a way that like we can continue to actually do what we're doing rather than reach a breaking point where we can't do it anymore.
Thank you. That's a great question. Not only because I just recently filed a piece for Culture that addresses this issue with a specific cheese that I'm really excited for people to read. It should be, I think, in the fall issue. So yes. So the question is basically like, when do we stop clinging to tradition in its most traditional form,
Yeah,
right? To adapt to the conditions that are changing. And
right.
what I would say is that PDOs adapt all the time. They, yes, they have rules. Yes, there are like long processes that go into changing those rules. But last year, when I was on the Comté trip, the Comté Association was in the process of doing like a huge update to the regulations, and they require 100% unanimous buy-in. And like, I would have killed to be a fly on the wall and also understand French like during that process. I like tried to ask them about it and they like did not want to answer my questions about it for the story I wrote for Culture. So like they absolutely adapt. There, none of those are set in stone.
Okay.
Comté used to have holes is a great example that I think I
Right,
first
right.
heard from Josh Windsor. They were like, we want to differentiate from other, Alpine style cheeses that have holes. We're not going to have holes anymore. Comté doesn't have holes anymore. So PDOs in some ways are like kind of a good system because it's a bunch of people kind of in their little bubble who can say like, all right, we've got market forces, we've got climate, we've got economic forces, we've got all kinds of different priorities and forces like that are coming into our little bubble. How do we want to respond to those? And maybe they have to message about it. Maybe it takes a lot of discussion. Maybe it takes like a lot of time, but they can make the decision to respond to those or not. So PDOs are kind of an interesting question
Mhm.
because we think of them as being like crystallized in stone. What those Solaire producers did is they produced Cantal.
Oh,
So
that's
like
amazing.
again, it wasn't Solaire. It wasn't exactly the same. If you had a piece, if you could have had a piece of Solaire and then a piece of Cantal together, like would you tell the difference? I'm sure people could. I've never done that taste test, but like, yeah, they have a way to do it. A bigger question to me, like zooming out from this is, and something that's kind of underlying that I never really explicitly say in the presentation, but because I don't want to sound too alarmist, if you can imagine that that was me not trying to sound too alarmist, is that like if we don't make some of these adaptations, like these traditions are going to become unavailable
Yeah.
because it's not going to be possible to raise cows in that area anymore, or it's not going to be, economically viable to do that kind of farming anymore. Like somebody like Lainey or somebody like Gloria, we're trying to recapture or reproduce or carry on these more traditional methods, and they are having a harder time doing it. So like the climate will adapt for us. We will lower our consumption and production of some of these products by virtue of the fact that we won't be able to produce them anymore if we don't decide to do it for us. And again, I'm talking like we have all kinds of time to think about this and make a decision and turn the ship around. And we're kind of in a different timeline than that, unfortunately. So my thought is that like I think as many quote traditional practices as a producer can use on their farm for real benefit, whether that's economic, environmental, climate, to the product, is a great idea. But those things, even just to implement those things, often takes this extra investment. It takes this extra time. It takes money that they don't have, and so that's why not having these programs that were supporting a lot of those things, even if they weren't perfect, even if they weren't being as active and aggressive as a lot of us would like to have seen them, not having those at all is really unfortunate. So that's kind of a long multi-part answer to a long multi-part question. But
No, that's cool. I guess,
yeah.
yeah, I guess I get that adapt. Yeah, no, that's cool. Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean adapting is we're gonna have to be more I guess flexible is maybe a word. And I posted something on Instagram like the Slow Food International like messaging around consuming animal products. I actually really like how they've approached it.
Mhm.
where they're encouraging you to like do the better thing, which is again often more expensive, often maybe not accessible, but they're saying if you're gonna eat meat, like try to eat better meat, try to eat better cheese, better dairy,
Right.
rather than being a hard line like traditionalist, you know what I'm saying? Of like, well, of course
Mhm.
we're gonna eat animal products. And I like that they're kind of meeting people where they are with that, and they're educating why one choice might be more beneficial than others, and they're probably adapting to what their approach would have been like 10 or 15 years ago.
So I have a couple questions. Just wanted to
Mhm.
start with this one though. So besides carbon emissions, like what other metrics are used to kind of assess climate change? And I know that you focused specifically on carbon emissions, but did your research kind of connect or bump up to any other metrics that were worth talking about?
Yeah, so greenhouse gas emissions are like the thing that causes climate change. That's why they're so important when we're talking about staving off like the warming of the climate globally. So, yes, however, there are a lot of factors like uh, ocean temperature, um, the state of our like glaciers and polar ice caps, um, like soil health, that really that kind of like interplay with those things and can make like a warmer, more acidic ocean is like bad for us for our purposes, because and so are like melting ice caps obviously, like not only are they making the problem of sea level rise more and like damaging those regions, right, and those ecosystems, they are like making it harder for us to slow the warming, or they're like helping the warming be faster. So those are kind of um adjunct factors that contribute to it, as well as like the human caused emissions that we're doing. But like the industrial revolution is like really what set us on this path. We've known about it for a long time. uh if you want to look into that, I can share some resources. There's a great podcast called Scene on Radio, and actually their capitalism season kind of talks about how um, a bunch of like thinkers, captains of industry, et cetera, kind of came together in the 60s, hired these scientists to research this problem. They came up with a solution, and then they were like, never mind. And it's just one of those things where it really is it's this human caused greenhouse gas emissions that are driving this problem. So um in terms of that, like that's the one. There are many, like it's a constellation of factors that affect like how an individual property or farm or region might be affected. Like the ability of the soil to hold moisture, or erosion, or like has a mountain been clear cut, and then the flood comes through. Like, so there are lots of other factors that can influence like how we experience the effects of climate change. But my understanding is that like greenhouse gases are like the main metric that drives climate change or not.
Um, do you have any suggestions on how cheesemongers can, or even producers, if they are consumer facing, how they can communicate with their consumers about these issues and what they are doing to offset, in their own personal farms and or shops? So what are your suggestions for like communication wise?
I mean, like, what is the purpose of the communication? Is it to get them to buy your product? Is it to get them to think that you are like one of the good ones? Is it to get them to understand the actual like challenge that we're facing, or like maybe the challenge that you as a business person or cheese professional are facing in like your work every day? Like, I think that's the question to ask. I think often when we are communicating about these things, it's to say like it's okay, you can still eat cheese. Like eat this cheese, don't eat that cheese. Which is understandable. Like we got to sell the cheese to continue doing this stuff, which is part of our problem. We can't just like hit pause on everybody's livelihoods and ways that they eat to like fix this, right? Even though it's kind of what we need to do. Well, not ability to eat, but but yeah, we need like big change. So I would say what I would love to see is like those people who are representing the product, representing the producer themselves, um, you know, take in this information and understand it. I think that's step one. Like, which is okay. Like it can be difficult to digest and process. But like get on the same page about what's actually happening and what needs to happen and where we fit into that much bigger picture, right? And then like message really honestly about it. Like I have to go places, I have to eat food, I have to wear clothes, and a lot of I can do a lot less of all of those things of, I can change how I do them, but we're like I have a light on. Like I just there's not a way that one individual or even like one business can make a change to feel like pure and like you're not doing anything wrong. So we have to live in like the uncomfortable zone and we have to like get customers okay with being in the uncomfortable zone, which is like the exact opposite of what you want to do when you're marketing. So like that would be my suggestion. Like I think people just being willing to educate themselves about what's really going on and being willing to like have real conversations that don't begin and end with your business. Like that kind of incorporate how our habits fit into this bigger picture, even if it's to say like I'm doing my best. Um, and like thank you for being in this corner of the food system with me. Um, like I didn't go super deep into this, but a lot of people are concerned that all of these like oat milk and plant milks and nut cheeses and like alternative quote unquote dairy products, people feel really threatened by those, but their availability in the market is not translating to consumption. Anywhere from 1 to 3% of the population globally is vegan. It's I'm sure it's smaller here in the US. Like those consumption habits aren't translating to people eating less dairy cheese. Maybe they're not eating the right dairy cheese. But as we talked about, we can't switch one type of consumption for the better one and still eat that much cheese. So that's why, it's nice to be able to have maybe a cheesemonger or a farmer producer at a farmer's market who is on that more sustainable scale of things, producing on that smaller scale, as well as encouraging you to consume maybe in a way that might be a little smaller scale, whether that's due to cost or availability. Like it's good to have them offer an alternative, but we just don't think about changing our consumption habits in that way. And it's just a super difficult conversation to have. I would actually love to, that's another project to like talk to some mongers. I've long wanted to survey people, like survey regular mongers and see how these conversations come up for them in like everyday life. And maybe that's another step to this research that I can do one day. But like find out like how those conversations happen. Maybe they're not happening as often as we think they might be. Maybe they're happening more. I mean, people have great ideas for how to talk about it.
Um, what are some of the best resources for people to keep up on information about where we are in the state of climate change outside of the obvious catastrophes that take over the media cycles?
I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I used it for a long time as a source of news, like not, news will often break on social media before it breaks in the media, both to just like find articles to read, find experts to follow, find scientists to follow. I kind of tried to do that same thing with a Blue Sky feed, and it's just I can't look at it because it's a lot of bad news. Not even specifically with climate, but just like everything is hard to follow. But I say like find some climate scientists or climate journalists to follow, see what they're doing. The Guardian is a good source. Civil Eats is a good source. Um, following some of these like big name bodies. I mean, EPA has to kind of have an asterisk going forward, because they're not going to be doing much of the P in EPA, the protection, unfortunately. Um, and however, like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Eat Lancet, um, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, like those are like big, established institutional names. Were like when I was looking for data and I was talking to climate science, they're like, yeah, like use like a trusted source, not some guy. So I found, yeah, Guardian was a good source. Like actual, like how we're doing on climate change, like a lot of wire services will publish news stories when one of these bodies like releases their annual report, for example. And again, in the States, we might not be doing that as often or not participating. So like, especially now, if you're in the US or if you read a lot of US news sources, like now is a good time to diversify that media diet. Tracy points out that the Canadian government is still posting North American data. So like, thank you for that. We're going to have to be looking to maybe other governments, other like media outlets that are based elsewhere, like Al Jazeera, for example, BBC, for example. I mean, like a lot of news outlets do have some kind of slant or are problematic in some ways, like almost none of them are perfect. I have long wanted to publish like the milk-fed bibliography in my newsletter just to show some of the sources that I look to, either for a lot of it for ways to think about these challenges as well as actual news. But I unfortunately have like my own little mini news fire hose, and I get a lot of it from there. Um, so yeah, build one of those for yourself with like some trusted climate scientists and journalists to cover these issues.
Well, Alex, is there anything you want to leave us with?
It's hard to take in a lot of this information. It's hard to sit with it. I think it's helpful to sit with it so that you can process and maybe like move through it to a place of action. That's kind of where I was when I began this research, is I was just like anxious and miserable all the time. And I was like, how can I turn my anxiety and misery into something that might be educational or helpful? And in the process, like feel like I am slightly less alone or slightly less miserable and anxious. And I don't know if that worked, but I have felt a lot of gratitude, and like I've been doing something around this, like whatever your something is, whether that's having conversations with people is huge, just like actually talking about stuff with like your friends and family and neighbors and people around you. Thinking about, not in a crazy prepper kind of way, but in a, I want to be prepared. Let me rationally approach some of these potential eventualities and address them. Like I think that's a smart thing to do. And yeah, find a way to engage in this issue in your daily life, like some kind of work that you can do, whether that's planting trees or helping farmers or helping your neighborhood in some way or yelling at politicians. Like find a way to channel this frustration and anxiety into action. Like that's even if it's not action to stop it, if it's action to adapt, if it's action to build resilience, like that's super important too.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us and sitting in the uncomfortable because, yeah, it's a lot, but it's fantastic to be able to sit with others and commiserate about the state of dairy and cheese. So thank you guys all and for supporting the DZTE and continuing cheese education.
Thanks, everybody.
If you'd like to host an event at your space benefiting DZTE, please get in touch with us and we can send along our new standard operating procedures created by board member and Formaggio Kitchen owner Julia Hallman. Donations are always accepted directly on our website, and we hope you'll consider donating so we continue to offer opportunities like this. Thank you for being here and for your support and commitment to furthering cheese education.